Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I reside, on Turtle Island, is situated within the dish with one spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and that it bound them together to share the territory and protect the land. This land is colonially known as Toronto. I'm a PhD student in community psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University, as well as the executive and artistic director of KW Centro, which is the Kitchener-Waterloo Center for Filipino-Canadian Music, Language, and Culture. Both the university and the organization I lead are situated on the traditional territories of the Chinantan, also known as the Neutrals, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is on the Haldeman Tract, which is the land promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and is the land that is 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, colonially known as Kitchener-Waterloo. KW Central stands in solidarity with Palestinian, Congolese, Sudanese, and the Sami people of the region on which we gather this morning, as well as oppressed indigenous peoples globally in their parallel struggles against Western imperialism and the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dion Flores, and I'm greatly looking forward to sharing my research with you this morning. My presentation is entitled Confronting Racism in Canadian Music Conservatories, Healing Trauma Through Community Music. A point of clarification, this presentation will be a spoken presentation and not a discussion as my abstract outlines. I have been giving presentations like this for the last 2 years. At first, I resisted providing a trigger warning. However, in my experience, I have learned it to be necessary. For Black, Indigenous, and people of color, this presentation can be incredibly affirming and validating, but equally as overwhelming and triggering. There are active listeners and allies in the room that are open to supporting you. To all folks in the room, please seek them out as needed. To white people, though there are activists, revolutionaries, and non-performative white allies among us in the room, some of you may experience an overwhelming and irrational reaction to what I will say today known as white fragility. When confronted with topics about race, you may deny, evade, argue, deflect, lie, and in most damaging cases, even cry. We acknowledge that you, though you are the beneficiary of a legacy of violence and genocide through colonialism, also desire to heal, even though your relationship with your white privilege may make that connection difficult to see. If it becomes too difficult, please excuse yourself from the room and touch base with conference staff, active listeners, or your support people if you feel unsafe. I am a community musician, music educator, choral conductor, and pianist. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, where I studied classical music as a young child. I completed an undergraduate degree in music education at Wilfrid Laurier University and a master's in choral conducting and a bachelor of music education degree from Memorial University. In 2023, I graduated from the MA in community music at Laurier and entered the PhD in community music the year after. Currently, I am a former PhD community music student and a current PhD student in community psychology. A harrowing, disturbing, and disappointing story I am happy to share with you when we connect during the conference. After completing my undergraduate degree in 2015, I moved to St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada to pursue a master's in choral conducting. At first, people were very welcoming. They were excited to work with me, but I should have seen my mother's comment at a restaurant as a precursor of what was to come. She asked the waitress to come over and she said, "Why is everyone looking at us like we have a disease?" Her comment made me aware of the strange fixated stares we were getting from the locals. Had they never seen racialized people before? It was 2015, but Newfoundland is known to be very secluded, both geographically and ideologically. Over the 3 years I spent in St. John's, I faced targeted and systemic racism and discrimination by the faculty of the School of Music and Music Education Department at Memorial University and the surrounding community. I was actively excluded from employment, gossiped about, and passed up for prestigious awards and scholarships by my white colleagues. I graduated without a single accolade that I could go into the professional world with. those white peers I speak of, continue to be the right hands of the most powerful music educators in the province today, waiting in line to one day assume those roles, just as a white-dominated, nepotistic institution naturally functions. A conductor of a regional children's choir, known to be one of the kindest people you'll ever meet, sat me down after rehearsal one day and said, "You can no longer work with the choirs. It's just weird that a man is conducting a children's choir." What was she insinuating? In 2022, I would see that choir at Canada's National Choral Conference, and this time, a white male was conducting the choir. I guess it's not weird for a white male to conduct the choir. As a result of the compounding stress, what seemed to have been building up since I arrived in St. John's, I experienced a mental health emergency as a result of my experience. Over the next 6 years of my recovery journey, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health nurses, social workers, occupational therapists, and peer support workers documented my symptoms and helped me come to terms with what living in St. John's and interacting with Newfoundlanders did to me. When I started my MA, I had been doing community music and mental health drop-in centers as part of my own healing and recovery. I wanted my new choirs not to resemble the colonial, racist, white supremacist choirs that I grew up in and was trained in. Participants, with my guidance, helped select the repertoire. I began experimenting with alternative pedagogies, beginning to teach singing, such as replacing solfege with numbers, and lowering expectations for mistake elimination, and moving to lyric sheets instead of sheet music. The effect was healing for me, and I carry many of those techniques with me today. For my MA, I chose to write an autoethnography on my experience in Newfoundland. I started writing out my experiences, story mining, restorying, trying to put my writings in a chronological and logical order. I was heavily re-traumatizing myself during this process. So much was coming out, but I knew I had to get ahead of it and keep it all organized from the outset. I continued daily journaling and piecing together my narrative. I conducted interviews with 26 participants. They included close friends, racialized students, and members of the Filipino community KW. I developed data collection questions and received ethics approval. Interviews were 60-minute semi-structured Zoom interviews. During the research process, I began to read deeply into critical white studies and equity studies, and it became clear that the following framework underpinned my experience in St. John's. White racial grammar normalizes the standards of white supremacy. It works to reinforce the white racial order as the way things are. It shapes how we see or don't see race in the environment, as well as if matters are considered racial or not race-related. White racial grammar provides the deep structure, the logic, and rules of proper composition of racial statements, and more importantly, of what can be seen, understood, and even felt about racial matters. This is similar to Joe Fegan's white racial frame that says this racial frame is an overarching worldview, one that encompasses important racial ideas, terms, images, emotions, and interpretation. In addition, Fegan describes spaces as being part of a social front stage and a social backstage. He asserts that blatant racist thought, commentary, and performance has become concentrated in the social backstage, a space where only whites are present. Less of this behavior happens in the social front stage, areas like workplaces, public accommodations, all because of a pressure that people feel to be politically correct and colorblind. In a journaling exercise Fegan did with his students, he asked them to journal any instances of racism that they witnessed. One of his students, Hannah, wrote in her journal that, quote, "It is this sort of joking that helps to keep racism alive today. People know the places they have to be politically correct, and most people will be. However, until this sort of behind-the-scenes racism comes to an end, people will always harbor those stereotypical views that are so prevalent in our country." According to Ellen Wu, professor of history at Indiana University at Bloomington, the model minority myth in the United States characterizes Asian Americans as smart, wealthy, and compliant. In Color of Success, Wu elaborates that in the decades prior to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the model minority stereotype gained traction as government officials began promoting the idea that Asian Americans had successfully assimilated into American culture and overcame racism for the reasons that they worked hard and were law-abiding. It created a distinction between minorities. Wu articulates that distinction as definitively and decidedly not black. It became clear that this stereotype was used as a tool to shame and put down other minorities, namely black folks. Prior to World War II, Canada explicitly legislated racist immigration policies during a time period commonly referred to as the building of white Canada. Historically, Canada has also viewed Asian immigration as something to be deterred. For example, the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 placed a head tax on each Chinese immigrant entering Canada. By 1903, the head tax was $500, equivalent to 2 years' salary as a worker on the Canadian Pacific Railway. The 1910 iteration of the Immigration Act intentionally aimed to limit immigration to, quote, healthy, white, preferably British or American agriculturalists. Immigration was limited to those deemed, quote, desirable, and racialized folks were constructed into preferred races. The Chinese Exclusion Act would replace earlier legislation and sanction an outright ban on Chinese immigration to Canada with few exceptions. This legislation would remain in place until 1947. In the 1980s, similar sentiment that Asians were stealing Canadian jobs were featured on CTV's W5 News program. In Carol Anderson's 2016 book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, she articulates that the trigger for white rage is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the problem. Rather, it is blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is blackness that refuses to accept subjugation. In Atlantic Canada, my successes were not something to be celebrated. It was always met with a criticism and a scoff. By now, we should all be familiar with the burning of Black Wall Street during the Tulsa Race Massacre and the lynching of Emmett Till. Carolyn Bryant, the perpetrator of White Tears, died a few years ago and admitted on her deathbed that she lied about saying that Emmett Till flirted with her, which emboldened her husband, Roy Bryant, and brother-in-law John William Millam to kidnap, torture, and mutilate Till and dump his body in the river. His corpse was so deformed and unrecognizable at his funeral, his mother insisted that it was an open casket so that the public could see what they had done to him, what these white supremacists had done to him. Bell Hooks describes the social hierarchy in white supremacist capitalist patriarchy as one in which theoretically men are powerful, women the powerless, white people the powerful, other non-white peoples the powerless. In Teaching Community, Hooks asserts that the first step to confronting racism and domination is to reflect on our first remembered awareness of race as children. Quote, patriarchy, like any system of domination, for example racism, relies on socializing everyone to believe that in all human relations there's an inferior and superior party. One party is strong, the other weak, and it is therefore natural for the powerful to rule over the powerless. To those who support patriarchal thinking, maintaining power and control is acceptable by whatever means necessary. She says, therein lies our power to demand change. Hooks gave me a language to describe what was happening to me. I was experiencing racism. However, white folks around me behaved as Paulo Freire said they would. They would try to convince me that I was imagining the whole thing because me coming to consciousness threatened their power and investment in the system of oppression that they benefited from. For a complete manuscript, you can visit my publications page at www.dionjflores.com. My MA work led me to cultivate a practice of activism. I wanted to reconnect with my Filipino heritage as an active act of resistance against white supremacy. What better way to resist white supremacy than to re-educate myself in a language and culture that was stolen from me during a lifetime of assimilation to dominant white Canadian culture? Thus brings the birth of KW Central. This is the Kitchener-Waterloo Center for Filipino-Canadian Music, Language, and Culture. Before KW Central was formally established, I formed the Filipino Community Singing Group, which we call now the Adult Choir. As a community project for my MA, we enjoyed an extensive performance schedule with community partners and dialogued about racism and discrimination in the Filipino community of our small town. In the summer of 2023, we became an incorporated nonprofit organization in the province of Ontario. We established a board of directors and began planning the inaugural Filipino Cultural Gathering and Symposium. During our first season, which just ended in May, we established the KW Filipino Children's Choir. We applied for provincial and federal grants. We mobilized Filipino community members in KW to successfully host the Filipino Cultural Gathering and Symposium in May 2024. The execution of the symposium was by the KW Central Board of Directors, the KW Central Choirs, and the St. Mark's Catholic Church Choir Group, where we hosted and enjoyed a full concert and workshop by the Philippine Madrigal Singers. For the symposium, we raised $17,000 in 3 months, from February to May. In this photo, you can see the KW Filipino Children's Choir, the Musika Children's Chorus, a Filipino-centered multicultural choir, which I'll talk about in a moment, based in Mississauga, just about an hour east of us. The KW Central Adult Choir and the Philippine Madrigal Singers, and in the bottom right corner, you'll see the Bahandi Singers. We began as a Filipino choir. We opened our doors to children and adults of all communities, but we specifically recruited Filipino children and adults. This gave us 1 year to figure out who we were, to see Filipino-ness centered and affirmed. We had a very successful first year. Our newly expanded identity of Filipino-centered multi- and interculturalism shines a light on a misnomer, that racialized folks must gather only in their own cultures, thus reinforcing the white supremacist and colonial lines of vision. Our critical consciousness has risen this year. We are stronger as a coalition of racialized and marginalized people, taking unified aim at the true poison in our world, white supremacy, and the manifestations of historical colonization. We have piloted this project in the Waterloo Region District School Board schools, which led to a collaborative performance at the Kitchener-Waterloo Multicultural Festival. Through this mandate, we hope to cultivate Filipino culture as a touch point for children of various backgrounds to reconnect with their own heritage, conduct workshops with the Toronto Catholic District School Board, working toward establishing the Scarborough Filipino Children's Choir. And as an associate conductor of the Hamilton Children's Choir, I continue to bring Filipino repertoire and cultural education to the organization. Some upcoming projects. We are working with Sri Lankan music educators and opera singers to develop workshops for Sri Lankan music education. Also, we are in solidarity with Sumudna, the Toronto protest choir led by Palestinian and Jordanian community musician. She is not CM trained and is frankly better than most facilitators I've seen. Some highlights for our upcoming season include an intercultural choral improvisation workshop by Dr. Gerard Young, and the second annual Filipino Cultural Gathering and Symposium from May 23 to 25. You're all invited to come join us in Kitchener. Some concluding remarks. Racism can lead to mental illness. Racism and white supremacy are alive and well in community music. Culture and language reclamation can be practiced as an active act of resistance against white supremacy. The racists and white supremacists that forced me out of the PhD in community music program are here at CMA this week. Some of them gave presentations this week. Though they are violent, they are desperate to find healing, but because of their dependence on white privilege, they stand in their own way. I recommend Me and White Supremacy by Lila Saad, workshops by Salam Debs, and So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, to learn more about how to be a good ally, ancestor, accomplice, and activist. I invite you to read the works of Robin DiAngelo and practically every Black writer on the guidance of how to overcome white fragility. Remember, it is psychosomatic. It is not an intellectual exercise. Just like oppression has affected my neurobiology, white fragility is coded into your nervous system.
less than a minute.
Thank you so much for listening today. It brings me so much healing to be able to share this story of resilience and triumph with practitioners of decolonial community music. For those of you who are early or at the beginning of your journey, the next best time to get started is now. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and of course this is a challenging narrative that goes against a lot of other narratives that we are thrown many narratives. And for myself being, I get really nervous when people even mention the Asian thing. And my family, I know, but my family of course lived under that. In California, they didn't lift their anti-Chinese laws till 1955. So it's like, and by then they were like, well, we just don't vote. You know, it's like, and so it took a long time to recover from that in my generation. But let's hear from you, because this is challenging. Oh, I want to throw it.
Okay, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. I've got a different type of question. What type of music does children sing in your choir, and in what language?
Yes. So we love the children's choir to be 100% in Tagalog. We would love that, but of course there's varying levels of language proficiency in that choir. So the main mode is English. We have really focused on Tagalog folk songs. Now I know many of you may know that Filipino language is Tagalog. Let me just explain that a little bit. There's 182 distinct languages in the Philippines. None of them are mutually intelligible, so you can't understand each other. So in 1947 they declared Tagalog to be the Filipino national language so that there was a common language, but it's still heavily regional. So for example, I rehearse with the Bahani singers who are from Iloilo, so they speak Ilonggo. When they're talking, I'm like, oh, I have a vague idea of what's happening. And then I check in with my friend and I'm like, is this what they said? I'm like, no. It's because we have common words, but they mean completely different things. So it's not even easy. So we sing primarily in Tagalog, but we've been in touch with many scholars across the US and in the Philippines, and they've helped us find folk songs from all over the Philippines, so through the Visayan regions and through Mindanao. So we have an arranger who writes music for us too, and just things that we can't have access to, because Philippine music publishing is a different monster. But he makes those songs for us. So Tagalog primarily, but we are always looking for music educators and language instructors of different Filipino languages to be part of KDV Centro. It's just we're just at this part of our history where I am the principal instructor, which I only speak Tagalog. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you want to toss this?
Sir. Well, I got to ask already. Somebody else. All right. A trickier question, perhaps. So I saw Salam Duds on your list there. She's somebody I interviewed for my film, which is at 11:30 in one time. We had a great conversation about code switching, and you and I were speaking about this at breakfast, where if you and I are in the same room and I get angry, I'm expressing my opinion passionately. And Dion, if you were to get angry, we're to be scared because that's how we're coded. What Salam had said to me was that anger is a privilege for white people, and innocence belongs to white children, white women. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I think something all my presentations do is that I just do away with this mandate that we have to keep white people comfortable. Frankly, you need to stop that. Right? Like, we're just trying to have these challenging conversations because your ignorance to the topic is continuing to kill black men and women. Have you heard of Sonia Massey? She's a paranoid schizophrenic woman who was shot in the face because well, I mean, it's the US, so no reason, by police, right? So that just happened 2 days ago. So people are literally dying because her saying, she said, I will rebuke you in the name of Jesus. And we know that religiosity is a very big part of mental illness. And he got threatened, as white cops do, and bang, right? Then we know Breonna Taylor was shot in her sleep. We know Ahmaud Arbery was taken. So this code switching, if I raise my voice, which I've been very careful not to do, you're going to think that I'm an angry Asian man, right? And I've been very careful not to do that because I want to counteract that natural conditioning that white folks have because of white supremacist socialization, which we've all been a part of, right? So I'm intentionally code switching. I'm being careful about what I say, how I say it, don't try to shoot me. And that's something racialized people do every day. I've been doing it since I was born.
And on this side, anyone? Yes. I'm not going to throw
Big
that
throw.
I'm not.
Thank you so much, Dion, for your wonderful presentation. You talk about keeping white people comfortable. So I encountered the white Australia policy when I was 12. And only white people, and I was the only brown boy in the whole city of Melbourne. And it has been so beaten into me to keep white people comfortable. So, you know, it's almost 60 or whatever years of feeling the oppression of keeping white people comfortable. It's almost possibly now to break out of that. And I'm always concerned about that. I think what your wonderful presentation does is forces an interrogation of the collective comfort, the people who occupy places of privilege and so on. And also not only white people, but other people who adopt a kind of white-skinned black masks sense of understand. Sorry?
Yeah.
You say something?
That title is Frantz Fanon.
Yeah, Fanon,
Yeah.
exactly. So I'm grateful for at least unsettling us. We are we're settled not only as colonizers, but we're actually settled as a community of scholars. And I think one of the things that we can do is actually desettle and unsettle us. And I'm grateful for your presentation for that reason.
Am I able to respond to that very quickly? Yeah. I think I am fighting every piece of coding in my nervous system to keep white people comfortable. Basically, in dialectical behavioral therapy, which I've been through a ton of, they said, when you're trying to overcome negative thinking and psychosis symptoms, try the opposites thing. If you have this distressing thought that's telling you to do this one thing, just experiment with what if it was the other way? And so the natural conditioning is keep white people comfortable, be subservient, say ma'am, say sir, all those things that my parents do all the time that I was taught to do, right? To keep in line, not to get shot, all those things. And so I'm trying the opposites thing. I'm literally just going, let's just do the other way. And I find it's very effective. It makes people uncomfortable, but I really want to help. And I don't think the comfort is helping you. It's actually digging you deeper into that psychology, which is the poison.
Okay, let's see if you did. That's good. Brilliant. We have time for one more. Why did I have to run?
It's a ball.
It's like a cartoon.
Look nice. Maybe this is an intimate question, but it popped up in my mind when you talked about your therapy. Was it like your therapists, were they white people or were they also racialized people? Because I think when you talk about these conditionings you have been gone through your whole life, is there even awareness for that in your therapy? Because this is the problem is all over the place. And
in the intake appointment, when I was in active psychosis, they were all white, which was highly oppressive. But then I think they realized that racism was a big piece of what I was experiencing. So my psychiatrist, later when I was placed, the psychiatrist was Korean, the mental health nurse, the first one was an Indian woman, the next one was a Chinese man, the peer support worker was a black woman. So I think that was intentional to put me around those people because, the intake appointment went so well, right? Because that white woman was just doing the racism, dismissing the experience. You're in a mental health hospital and you're not even believing the patient. It's you have a doctorate, It's crazy. It's crazy. It's crazy getting through higher education and never encountering racism in a robust way. It's massive. I went through my whole teaching degree. I'm about to have access to kids. No classes on social justice. And now those teachers are in the system. Yikes. They're dangerous to children. Right? So yeah, it's the team. I was very fortunate to have that team that was all racialized people, but the white people were definitely there. But I think I was intentionally kept away from them.
It's good to know. I just want to thank you personally as well. And what I see in here, and I think what we're trying to negotiate is all these different narratives. And we've got some narratives that just clash. So we have a community music narrative that we accepted and adopted, and I'm wondering how, in co-creating a new narrative or a varied narrative with one another, like co-creating it with people of color and Black and Indigenous people all over the world, let's say, do you have thoughts on how that narrative might come about or how we might evolve that?
I think something that's talked about very widely in our community music cohort when I did my MA is that, you know, Lee Higgins, Lee Willingham, Bridie, Catherine, thank you for your work. We kind of got it wrong, right? It's like authored by predominantly white people that when they speak, it's like, they don't know who Bell Hooks is. They don't know who Angela Davis is. The core writers of Black feminism, right? And Black women are like excluded from that narrative, right? Which leads to death. So great, we got started. Let's dig in. Like, let's get into the real work. Let's defer to racialized people who experience oppression and ask them, what do we do? Because like you've been trying for such a long time, it's like, you're not getting there, right? We're waiting patiently in the sidelines, code switching, so that the conferences aren't inflammatory. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much that we're letting fall at the wayside because we're just trying to keep white people comfortable. It's tragic.
Okay, so we are out of time with that. We need to move on. Thank you.